I've made most of these videos with the assumption that you are already familiar with PTSD, that you've been diagnosed, that you suspect you have it, you care for someone who has it, has a diagnosis. So I'm going to break down kind of some of the therapies and some of the treatments that are used. And it'll help explain kind of how I got to the other side of it. So I was diagnosed in the early 2000s, and it wasn't because I was showing signs and symptoms. It was because I was in that numbing stage. It's very, very normal for after a trauma to occur. There is, I think the TV shows describe it as shock, where you don't have that full awareness, you're not really completely there, your brain's trying to digest what just happened. And in the TV shows, they'll have like a therapist will come in, oh, they're in shock, and they pull the person aside, and then before your hour TV show is over, they're all better and they've recovered and they can testify and they can do all of this stuff. That's not really the way the brain works or how life works. If it's not in the script, it can take a long time for your brain to actually digest what happened and go through all of the emotions and sensations that are involved. So that someone will be in shock for an hour and then they'll be just fine is Hollywood. That's not necessarily the truth. So when you're in that numbing stage, a lot of people turn to drugs, alcohol, some get very violent, extreme sports, because you're not feeling. There's a real numbing where it's hard to be happy. You don't get really sad, but you're not happy either. So depression can sink in because you're like, life is worthless. There's no meaning. There's no joy. There's no... so you can get suicidal before you even start having flashbacks, nightmares, or being triggered. A trigger is basically an event that takes your body back into flight and fight. So I know they have flop and flee, and there's all of these things that they've added. But it's when something, and it can be anything, reminds you of a time that you were scared or that you had to react in the moment, when your senses, your animalistic instincts had to take over. Could be real, could be imaginary, but when you feel like, well, when you feel too much, that you can't think your way through that moment, basically. So these triggers, this is where PTSD gets really complicated, and why people have a really hard time recovering is because the triggers can literally be anything. Whatever it was in that surrounding that your senses picked up can remind you of that event. So let's say it's a car accident, but you keep Kleenex in your car, and when the car impacted, the Kleenex box went flying. You know, your head hit, the airbag goes off, you're being rushed to the hospital. But 2 or 3 years later, you could see a Kleenex box and go and get jumpy. But we don't associate that Kleenex box. There's no way you would think, oh, I'm afraid of Kleenexes. That's not what happens. So the trigger happens because your senses pick up something that happened at that same time of the trauma, and it puts your body back into fight or flight. It's reactionary and it's normal. But it doesn't have to be Kleenexes. It can be, okay, I used a car accident. I know hairbrushes is a big one for children that were beaten with hairbrushes. So they may go weeks or months without brushing their hair. It's not because they don't want to brush their hair, it's because they associate the hairbrush with being hit. Let me try to think of something. It'll come up before this video's over, I'm sure. So when we're getting treated for PTSD, they are often trying to treat the reaction. That's called behavioral therapy. They want to change the behavior. You get triggered, and they, instead of wanting to retreat, if that's your go-to, or running, or getting aggressive if you go into the fight mode when you're triggered, they want to change that behavior. They want you to kind of be able to recognize when you're triggered, which can be a whole problem in and of itself. And then they want you to adjust the behaviors that happen after that. So behavioral therapy has some benefits if it's something you have to be around and you need to not have those same reactions to. However, it also kind of creates more insecurities, because when you're afraid or you're scared, when you're telling yourself that you don't have the right to be afraid or scared, and that it's not appropriate for you to be able to react the way you instincts want to react, you're telling yourself that you're wrong all the time. So there's a level of behavioral therapy that's good, that say you normally get violent, for you to be able to say, okay, I need to not hit. That's good. But if you only do behavioral therapy and you are constantly telling yourself that you're wrong or that you're bad or that your feelings aren't valid or you're justifying why you need to change your behavior, that can create damage. Nightmares, triggers, flashbacks continue. Aversion therapy. I give aversion therapy a lot of shit. But the reality is it's very useful in some aspects. That's when you just avoid all triggers. This is what creates agoraphobes, or people that are afraid to leave the house, because they don't know what, they don't know when, they don't know how. Sometimes they don't know exactly what their reactions are going to be. So if you avoid everything that could potentially cause some kind of reaction, you don't have a life. The other problem I found in aversion therapy is that then when you are exposed, now you've got some real issues. So if you're jumpy with noises because an accident happened and there was a lot of loud noises, there was a lot of loud sirens, there was a lot of loud things, and so when you hear loud noises, you go into that fight or flight. Even if you're at home, if somebody rings the doorbell, that can trigger you and you get jumpy. You don't really have a way of telling. I mean, if you're just stuck at home, eventually you're going to need something delivered, right? You're going to need food, toilet paper, whatever. So aversion therapy has its uses, but to use it full time, it means you don't have a life. And then, you're back into that suicidal, life has no meaning, why do I bother? So you got some issues there. I got the sun going on. I'm going to try to just adjust for the sun and keep the video running. So behavioral therapy. We're triggered. We just need to handle how we respond. Our feelings need to be squished. Aversion therapy. We're just not going to have a life. We're not going to go outside. We're not going to be around loud noises. We're not going to date. We're not going to do anything because that could trigger me. I'm going to call it shock therapy. This is what I find to be the most damaging, and I think that it's caused a lot of societal problems as well. That's where if you're triggered or if you're having flashbacks, they want you to do something physical to yourself to remind yourself of the present. The theory behind it is kind of good, right? You're having a flashback, you're living in that moment is not happening, so you need to come back to reality. They recommend snapping a rubber band, holding an ice cube, doing something physical to remind yourself that you are here in this moment and you're not reliving that trauma. I think this is where a lot of the cutting came in. Remember there was that fad where kids were cutting on themselves and they said that it would alleviate the pressure and it would alleviate the pain. When you're teaching people that if they physically do something to themselves that they'll be better, where does that line stop? So I was in a very expensive program, and that was their belief system. Snap a rubber band, do this, do that. And I remember at one point banging my head on the wall. I was in really bad flashbacks, and I tried the rubber band, and I tried the ice cube, and I tried everything, and I'm banging because if I just hurt myself enough, it will remind me to be in the now. You can get some accidental suicides that way too. If you're teaching someone that if they physically harm themselves, it will remind them of the moment, and they're in bad flashbacks. So that's a training that needs to be stopped. The other problem with that is that coming out of the flashbacks, I don't know, is really the best choice. So the trauma happened. You're reminded of something. You're feeling those feelings that you weren't able to get out, adjust. And that's one of the big differences between having a trauma in recovery and having a trauma in PTSD. Holocaust survivors have very little PTSD because they were able to talk about it, they were able to bond with it, they had the entire world fighting for them, saying that the treatment they were receiving was wrong. They were able to debrief the situation. And we're all in agreement, right? You're not supposed to rape, burn, massacre, cut science experiments on other people. The whole world agrees. This is bad. Don't do this. Well, there's some jerks that don't, but that's a different issue. Vietnam vets that went to the war, and they were exposed to murder and mayhem and all kinds of evil, and their lives were in danger every single day, and they didn't know from when or where a bullet was going to come, how long they were going to live, sometimes if they were going to eat again. They didn't have access to always, the food and the shelter. And they got back thinking that they're going to be safe and they're going to be at home, and they got beat up. They got told that they were wrong, and a lot of them were forced into it. They were drafted. They did not have a choice. It was jail or war. So when they got back and they were beaten up and ridiculed and condemned, and in some cases even shut out of their families because how dare they participate, even though they didn't have a choice in it. A lot of them have PTSD, and a lot of them are homeless right now because they never did adapt and they never did adjust. They didn't have that chance to debrief the situation. Flashbacks, in my experience, so this is what I have found has been for me. This is how it works for me. I'm fine. I'm absolutely fine. I remember checking myself into a place and talking to the doctor, and I'm like, everything is wonderful, great, life is wonderful. And then all of a sudden I said, it's like a seizure or something. I'm going through the day, everything is good, and then bam, I have a blackout. I call it lost time in my journal when I stop journaling and I stop doing anything. And the next thing I know, I'm waking up someplace else. Eventually, I started drinking during those times because I didn't trust myself to do anything. But initially, that was not the case. And when I say waking up, I mean consciously aware of where I'm at and what I'm doing. So I have woken up in class going to college. I have woken up driving, which is very scary, or at the store, or, and I'm looking and people tell me I've been functioning, but I don't have any memory of the last few days. And that's really scary. That's really freaky when you don't know where you've been at and what you've been doing. No drugs. Initially, there was no alcohol. It was just, I would be perfectly fine doing what I'm doing, journaling, my life is, everything's good, and then all of a sudden, it's days later, and I don't know where I was at. That's scary. That is really freaking scary. So, you're living your life, there's a triggering event, something happens, there's a sound, there's a noise, something is picked up in your optics that you weren't necessarily paying attention to. It reminds your body of a time of trauma, and you go into fight and flight. You quench that. Use your behavioral therapy. This is not real. This is not real. That was then. This is now. And you shove those memories back again. And you keep doing that. And you do that over and over again. You feel fear when you shouldn't feel fear. And you're like, okay, I need to get over this. I'm not in danger. There's no problems here. I don't know what's wrong with me. And you beat yourself up on that. This is wrong. This is wrong. I shouldn't be anxious. I shouldn't be fearful. I shouldn't be thinking this. I shouldn't want to run and hide. I shouldn't want to do all of these things. And we blame ourselves. And we push that away again. So after trigger after trigger after trigger, and you have behavioral therapied yourself into not allowing yourself to have those feelings, those end up in nightmares and flashbacks. Because your brain, when your subconscious is running, is like, hey, you didn't deal with this. Hey, remember me? Hey. And the nightmares happen. And then they happen some more. And then you're afraid to go to sleep. Because you're afraid of the dreams. You'll wake up from a bad dream and you'll not want to go back to bed. You jack up on coffee, you do whatever, and you need to process this. But you have your day. You have to go to work. You've got the kids. You've got this is happening and that is happening. And you can't deal with this. There was a movie, it seems like it was Julia Roberts and one of hers, that said, I don't have time for the nervous breakdown I deserve. And that's what we do. I don't have time for this. I can't deal with this. It's just a dream. It's just a dream. We're going to push that away. We're going to push that away. Well, your brain is still collecting all of this. And now you have traumatized yourself and traumatized yourself and traumatized yourself over again. Because every time you have a reaction, you tell yourself it's not acceptable to have that reaction. Flashbacks start happening. So with me, it's usually a triggering point. I shove it down. I don't have time for this. Nightmares. And then next thing I know, I'm blacking out again and I'm having flashbacks and I'm reliving traumas. And it feels real. It feels like this is happening right now. Maybe not word for word or moment for moment, but my last really bad spin, and I think it was probably a couple of months, I had been triggered into, you kind of have to see the injustice system or DV for a catch here, but I'd been triggered into being with my ex and that threat of violence and the knowledge that he could kill me at any moment, that he's a marksman shot, he could just drop me wherever I'm at. So I was in fear, in my car, terrified. The people I loved, trying to get a hold of me, and I thought my ex was after them, and he was going to get to me through the people that I loved. And I spiraled for probably a couple of months, that there was no place I could go to be safe. If I ran my loved ones, I was going to track them, and he was going to kill them too. I mean, and fabricated in theory, right? But my emotions felt real. It felt like this is what is happening. My ex has found me, and as everyone had warned me time and time again, if he found me, he's going to kill me. He's going to hurt the people I love to get to me. So, was it really happening? Inside of me, it was. I was still living in that land of fear and in that land of terror, that if I were found, if somebody, if he knew where I was at, he would hurt me and all of my loved ones. I was trained to believe that. So that belief system isn't necessarily false. But I didn't get all of that damage taken care of to get to that point. Usually by the time you're spiraling and you're out of control, you had warning after warning after warning after warning, and you push that aside. In this case, I had, and I knew I had been. I was dating someone, and there was always that feeling of something's wrong. And it was that trigger after trigger after trigger after trigger. And I was like, man, he's so wonderful. He's so perfect. Why do I keep triggering? Oh, this is separate than that. This is separate than that. This isn't the same thing. This isn't the same. And now I look back and I'm like, oh, holy fuck. Of course that reminded me of being with my ex. Of course that reminded me of living under my father's roof. Of course there was this and there was that and there were all of these signs and symptoms. And I kept telling myself that they were not the same. They were the same. My brain picked up on the fact that they were the same. It was the same thing. Now, the man I was with is not violent, would never be violent. I 100% don't think he would ever hurt anyone ever. But those things that were said, those things that were done, those actions, behaviors, those were the same behaviors that my father and my ex-husband had. Different man, would never hit, but literally almost verbatim the same actions, reactions, thought patterns. Here's a really strong example. So we were together, and at this point I have triggered a few times, only I kept pushing it aside. There's no reason for that, right? This is different. This is not the same. And we had a conversation, and he told me his greatest fear was that I would do or say something that would embarrass him. And I laughed. I was like, that's your greatest fear. I'm someone who's been raped, molested, beaten, starved, imprisoned, all this stuff. I've got all this stuff going on, and his greatest fear is that he's going to be embarrassed. And he very adamantly repeated himself that his greatest fear is that I might embarrass him. And I snickered. I'm pretty sure we walked away from that conversation with two different thought patterns. He probably thought, because I told him it'll be fine, he probably thought I was going to do my best to not embarrass him. In my mind, I thought he would get embarrassed and he'd get the fuck over it, right? How could that possibly be someone's greatest fear? I thought we got over being embarrassed in kindergarten. That's not something to be afraid of. But at the initial onset of that relationship, I wasn't supposed to talk about being in prison. I wasn't supposed to let anybody know that I had been incarcerated, even though it was unconstitutional. and I should not have been in custody at all, that people might think things of me if they knew that I was in prison. Not to talk about dancing, not to talk about... So the very initial onset, when our relationship started, should have been a no-go. But I had been taught and trained. People don't like these things. You don't talk about these things. You need to keep yourself secret. You need to make sure people don't know. If people found out, then, whew. But shoving all that stuff down in my brain and shoving all those emotions and calling myself bad constantly, that if people knew me, if they knew me, then, I wouldn't be accepted. That was what was keeping me sick. That was 100% what was keeping me sick. It wasn't about healing, and it wasn't about getting better. It was about behavioral therapy, making sure that I did not behave in a way that other people didn't want me to behave. That's not who I am. I lived in prison for years. It was a wrongful incarceration. Because of that, I've studied the justice system quite thoroughly. That's not bad. I took the time to learn about things. It was a bad experience for me, and there's some, food hoarding and other things that happen from there. But the reality is that is a part of me. And for me to squish that is wrong. And it would have continued to create problems if every time the subject... So there's those little mosquito bites. And I know my family, I have definitely been told, it's too hard on them to think of what I went through. So they don't want me to talk about prison at all. Like, don't mention it. Because for them to remember what was done to me, how I ended up in jail and locked up with my face all bashed in, scarring and nerve damage, and my hand cut up and bleeding, and now I'm being... they said it's too much of a trauma for them to handle being reminded of it. I don't talk about it. Just don't talk about it. So I'm bad, right? I had this experience. And keep it to myself. Because if people found out... I found healing there by meeting other people in jail and prison. Being able to talk about the kiting system. Being able to talk about not being able to see the doctor. Or not being able to go to the dentist. Or, being starved. Not having any control. Lockdowns. Fire drills. I had nightmares and nightmares for years and years and years and years about the whole prison experience. But I wasn't allowed to talk about it. You go to group therapy, and you're in a room full of other people with other traumas, and they say you can say trauma, but you can't talk about... So if I was in group therapy, and I told, let's say, a DV, there was some issues there too, a DV victim that I was in prison, she's going to think, oh, so you can't talk about that. You just say the trauma. Well, that's not helpful. Because the trauma of being in prison and being locked up is much different than the trauma of being in a car accident. So you've got car accident people saying, well, during my trauma I experienced... That's not helpful. Different traumas have different experiences. So let me talk about how to... This is definitely getting long. How to separate them. What is your reaction? What is your feeling? With overcoming being in prison, I had to deal with and talk to other people that were in prison. My reaction to rhubarb, I did another video talking about that. Behavioral therapy and learning to not react bad when I see rhubarb was not the problem. The problem was being cold and being hungry and being helpless. So my recovery for getting over rhubarb was relatively the same as my recovery from molestation. Completely different issues. Completely different issues. Except internally, it was that being cold, being hungry, being helpless, and not feeling like I had any other choices. Those were the issues I had to deal with to overcome that. Being in prison, getting the numbers, finding out how many people are wrongfully incarcerated, because there's a lot of them. There's a lot of them. Being able to talk to other people that live through that same dehumanizing experience of no longer being a person and just being a number, and that you're void on face value. Just completely, there's no identifying that you are an individual. You are just another number. That was the same as court. Because in court, I was just a file on somebody's desk. I wasn't a person. I was just a file. And my father's abuse, a lot of that same thing. I wasn't a person. I was just something to hit. So when I'm dealing with child abuse, I'm dealing with prison, I'm dealing with the injustice system, the underlying factor to deal with is not being a person. And most of the recovery systems teach you to change your behavior and to deny yourself the feelings and emotions that come up when you're reminded of these things. That's dehumanizing and depersonalizing as well. So, what do you do with all these therapies? You mix and match them. Remember I told you make your healing be yours? You take that potato salad. So sleep, you will go crazy if you don't sleep. So if I go a few days without sleep, I might use aversion therapy for a little while until I'm sleeping and I can get that full night's rest. And there you go. Now I've got some sleep. And now little exposures. Not complete. So maybe avoid it so you can get some sleep. You know that if you watch the show, you get high strung. Don't watch that show for a night or two. Get some sleep, and then you can go back to watching the show. I do believe in little exposures. I don't believe in submersion therapy where you're just stuck in a vat full of spiders. I think that's a good way to end up in a nut house. But a little bit of exposure until you can build a resistance. Behavioral therapy. You're at family camp out, you're at a business dinner, you're doing something and you get triggered. Maybe practice a little behavioral therapy there. Say, okay, this is an inappropriate place for me to have this reaction. And then go home and scream in a pillow. Don't tell yourself no and that you're bad for having these emotions or feelings. Just use that behavioral therapy for that moment, get through that moment, and then let those feelings out later before they end up in your nightmares. Wonderful way of doing that. The shock therapy or create pain for yourself, I definitely think that should just be avoided. I really do. I really, really do. However, in the process of getting better, and I was finding what was helping long-term healing. You can get through, you can stay medicated and just numb yourself to everything. That is an option. And if that's the best choice for you because it's too painful to deal with these memories, then do that. Or maybe use medications long enough to start dealing with things and keeping those emotions kind of toned at the time so you can have some positive feedback. Because that's really big too, is that positive feedback. When you are fighting past or working through something and you realize you've got this, or you're doing better than you were. So, go back to rhubarb. So rhubarb would physically make me nauseous, only I didn't know why and I didn't know where. Not eating it, just seeing it. I would want to throw up at the grocery store. Just my eyes caught rhubarb and I want to physically be nauseous. So you get those little victories where, now I see rhubarb and I'm like, okay, that reminds me of being starved and small and helpless. Okay, so that's just rhubarb, it's no big deal. You have that little exposure and that little exposure, and now I can be around it without wanting to throw up. I still think it's disgusting, but I can go my day without wanting to throw up. You get those little victories, and then you work on the next thing, and then you work on the next thing. And I don't have nightmares anymore. I really don't. I've had bad dreams, which makes sense, but it's not the same thing. Flashbacks. Catch your flashbacks. When you're having a flashback, and this is probably, I think, the worst to get over, because you have to actually stop and recognize what is it that you're seeing and what is it that you're feeling. And I think, and a lot of times, if you can, take time off, go to your room, close your eyes, have that, and try to process what is it that you're seeing, because this will help you identify your triggers. If you can actually focus and see what's in I know they happen so fast and it hurts your head to try. It really does. I remember several times and it hurts your head, maybe a cold rag or something. Take some ibuprofen, Excedrin. But if you can actually see those memories and what is there for, and it hurts because all of those emotions, remember, your whole body is in fight and flight. You are feeling these traumas. But if you can actually see your surroundings in your flashbacks, if you have visuals, so you're feeling it, and then if you can that will help you identify some of your triggers. What was in the room? What was in the space? What were the sounds? What were the smells? What was and you have to keep doing it. For me, some of the abuses, and it friggin' sucked. It was absolutely miserable. But when you can start catching them and start seeing what was in the room and what was you can start identifying the triggers. You start identifying the triggers, You can work on them. So this has gotten pretty long. But that was my rabbit hole. I had to take the different therapies and mix and match them and use them, use this when this was good, use that part. That whole, you need to stick to this program, yeah, that's bullshit. Different traumas have different actions, have different reactions, and they need to be treated differently. Group therapy, huge. Getting me into group therapy, massive problem. Because I'm ashamed. I was ashamed and I was afraid. And if these people found out, and therapists will even tell you that, oh, you can't talk about prison in group therapy because, that will traumatize other people to know that they're sitting in a room with someone who's been in prison. So don't talk about that. So therapists tell you to keep your trauma to yourself. That's PTSD.online. It has all of the different traumas. So you can go and mix and match. Because again, my rhubarb problem wasn't rhubarb. It was being cold and tired and hungry. But sometimes you have to go down that rabbit hole. You have to figure out where is this issue at for me to deal with. Follow the rabbit hole. Because as I did, and I was like, oh shit, that was the problem. All this time I've been using behavioral therapy and that's not what the problem was. So my ex, my father, the boyfriend that I just absolutely adored, that having to watch your P's and Q's and make sure that you are appropriate at every single moment of every single day, that's a trauma. And that's what he was reminding me of. Having to be perfect every moment. And that if somebody thought or somebody saw or somebody knew, then I would be a bad person. So I had to work on my self-esteem, and I had to work on the fact that, you know what, a lot of people freaking love me. And I shouldn't have to hide who I am to impress people that I don't even know. And then they're not liking me anyways. If they don't know me, how can they like me? So that's that issue. Was the boyfriend a trigger? No. Was that being required to be perfect every moment of the day a trigger? Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what the trigger was. That's why I kept going off. And I'll tell you what, I napalmed that relationship. With all of his friends, I'd been in prison. And as far as he was concerned, I was out of control. And I was. But I never should have been in control. I should have never had to hide those facts and features. Getting better is because I started accepting who I was, and I started talking to other people that have been in similar traumas. The biggest leap I think I made was I was triggered drinking. Ran into a homeless, I'm guessing drinking too, vet, and he was talking to himself, and he was just kind of walking by, and he's like, I didn't mean to go, I didn't mean to go, I didn't mean to go. And I'm like, what? I'm already out on the streets. I wasn't homeless at the time, but I was out on the streets. And he goes, I didn't want to go to Vietnam. I didn't want to go. They made me. I didn't have a choice in the matter. They made me, and he was like, and I just wanted to go home. And then I got home, and then he was telling me about getting beaten up, and he was telling me about, now he's homeless because his family won't take him in because he participated in the war, and he just served his country, and he thought he was doing everything he was supposed to be doing. And even though I was triggered too, I identified that. I didn't mean to be raped. I didn't mean to be beaten. I had, in some of these cases, I had not been doing anything wrong. I was doing exactly what I should have been doing. I'm not the bad guy here. It's not my fault that our injustice system doesn't investigate anything. It was not that vet's fault that he was sent to Vietnam against his wills, against his wishes. How society handled him when he got back, that's their bad. That is not his fault. So in being able to identify that he was mistreated and he was used, and now he's homeless because he was told that the experience he had to go to war. He would have been in prison. He was not one of these rich millionaire, billionaire families that could buy their way out or come up with some doctor's note. He would have gone to prison if he had not gone to Vietnam. But since he went, now he's homeless. Nightmares, flashbacks. And I know they say that there's all kinds of resources for vets now, but guess what? How long has that been? What, a couple of years? They finally got a bill passed? So That's not on him. That's society. There you go. Here's my rabbit hole. That's how I overcame all kinds of shit. Followed it through. Where is the problem? Why am I having this problem? But talking to other people, and in some cases, especially when it comes to the actual signs and symptoms, the flashbacks and the nightmares, I know that it doesn't really matter the trauma. It's that feeling of being invaded and having that fear of PTSD. So talking to other people, even with other traumas, can help overcome some of those things. Talking to people specific to your trauma so you can talk about what it felt like to have a knife at your throat. What it felt like to be in a room watching someone else get shot. If you go to group therapy and you say, well, the trauma was very disturbing, that's not very helpful. If you can talk about when my friend was shot in the face, I felt like, that's helpful. PTSD.online. Free, anonymous, 24 hours. I am working on getting some funding to make sure it stays up, but this is how we're going to overcome this and how we're going to be able to change some of the societal issues. We need to start talking about things. Here's my rabbit hole, and that's where it took me. So, thank you for watching this, and I'm sorry it's so long.